Lovely, thank you very much. Before that, when you were all talking, you actually said, stop faffing about and get on with it. I think with the words. It's probably very, very apt.
I won't be able to come back again to do this.
Yeah, that's lovely. Thank you very much. It's really nice to be here, and especially when the sun's started kicking in. Very much appreciate you coming indoors for a bit. And it's a nice environment for me. So when I'm not doing PBS things or being with my family, which are my sort of two main things, I'm a scout leader, so it's quite a nice kind of environment to find myself in. So I'm going to talk to you this afternoon about mental health variables within a PBS framework. And the presentation I'm going to give is based on a paper called Mental Health as Motivational Operations, which was written by myself and Peter Baker, my colleague at Tizard, and it's fairly recently been published in the International Journal of Positive Behaviour Support. So you can find it there, or you can just email me and I'll send you a copy. So I'm going to sort of use that as the basis. So it's quite a brief presentation. I think we've got half an hour, and it's a relatively brief article in the context of a very big subject, really.
1 hour, Nick.
1 hour?
1 hour.
Is it an hour?
1 hour. Yeah, 1 hour.
Nice choice.
No, it's an hour.
Yeah, nice choice.
Well, in that case, it's an appropriately timed presentation. Anyway, that's great, and we can have some more time for discussion. So, the way this came about, and I think some of this will be familiar to people, but to set the scene. So back in 2013, there was a kind of bunch of folk, of which I was one, that wrote a special edition of the International Journal of Positive Behaviour Support, which aimed to do a few things, which tried to sort of describe and define PBS and think about the scope of the framework and think about different ways it could be kind of implemented and so forth. Not to kind of try and take sort of ownership of it, but to just try and give some sort of clarity and create some sort of shared sort of framework and way of talking about it to try and help things develop. That was the idea. And lots of things have happened since then. You know, it's been such a lot going on for PBS in the last 6 years or so. And one of the things which seems to be around more and more has been a sort of greater consideration of mental health variables in the context of challenging behaviour, and more discussion about sort of trauma and aversive life events and so on, which has been a very, very kind of useful discourse. I think sometimes though, it's almost been presented as an alternative to PBS, or almost like the bit that PBS doesn't kind of include, which can be problematic, I think, for the development of PBS. And it's maybe a sort of based on some sort of misunderstanding or miscommunication on whoever's part, we don't know. But that was part of the context that led to this paper. And we would argue, Peter and I have argued in this paper, that really PBS does explicitly talk about and consider mental health variables. You know, it's a big part of the model we operate with. So are people familiar with this sort of diagram? This is the one from the sort of the Hastings et al. 2013 paper, sort of conceptual model that might sort of underpin, help to explain the processes in PBS. And we've got this set of maintaining things in the middle about sort of social reinforcement and automatic reinforcement and so on. And then these sort of vulnerability factors over here. And one big set of those, there it is, was about psychosocial factors, and in that article gave examples of aversive life events and mental health variables and all of these other things. So it's kind of all in there, but maybe hasn't been kind of communicated fully. So yes, I guess, you know, criticism of PBS is maybe that it's there, but sort of finer detail of exactly how those things all work maybe hasn't been explored sufficiently, and maybe not emphasised sufficiently, which might have led to some of that kind of sense that it's not really inclusive of those ideas. And if that's the case, there's then also the danger that those bits look like a bit of an add-on. So like, well, here's the main event over here, and it's all this behavioural stuff, and about challenging behaviour, and and mental health's in there somewhere, but a bit of a kind of a bolt-on, and there's not really maybe enough to kind of guide, well, what do you do? How do you make sense of those mental health variables when they're present? How do you identify them? How do you sort of conceptualise them? And how do you support people in relation to those? And when that's the case, there's then the danger that those bits will either get neglected or they get kind of farmed out somewhere, like someone else's responsibility to take care of, and that someone else or those other people might not be people who are so well versed in the sort of values and practices of PBS. Okay, so that's dangerous. So what we wanted to try and do in this paper is to start to explore some of those things a bit more and see if we could find a way of starting to integrate some of those ideas more. Not to give like, this is the ultimate model or answer, because it's very, very complex, but just to try and sort of kick-start things. And what we hope is that people look at this and think, okay, well that's an interesting idea, that's way off, but that might make me think about this. And you know, as a community of researchers and practitioners and families, we can start to sort of generate those ideas. Okay, so I imagine that most people are familiar with this sort of 4-term contingency idea. Louise was saying before that this is almost like a room of PBS converted people. It's quite a safe environment to be in some ways. But again, just to sort of lead into the discussion, I think of 4-term contingencies as pretty integral to sort of models that underpin PBS and many of the practices of assessment, formulation, and intervention that occur within a PBS framework. So a 3-term contingency usually describes 3 things. So it talks about a discriminative stimulus, a kind of antecedent, a given behaviour, which follows, and a maintaining consequence. And the contingency links a relationship between those three variables. A 4-term contingency takes things a little bit further, and it helps to explain things which are a little bit more complex with a bit more precision. It adds in this 4th term, which sometimes we call a setting event or something like that, but more technically we sometimes call a motivational operation. Okay, is that a term that's familiar to some? Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Excellent. Good. You can tell me if I'm getting it right then. So with motivational operations, this is usually how we kind of think of them. So a discriminative stimulus, kind of antecedent that happens before behaviour typically. What it's really doing is effectively signalling the availability of a given reinforcer. Right, just that it could occur contingent on a behaviour. A motivational operation is a bit different. It also occurs before behaviour, right? But it really concerns the value of that reinforcing consequence. So just because it's available, it doesn't necessarily mean it's sort of desired or kind of reinforcing as such. We can think of 2 types of motivational operation, EOs and AOs. So firstly, establishing operations. So these are MOs that increase the value of a reinforcer and are therefore associated with increases in the given behaviour, okay? And abolishing operations, which kind of do the opposite really. So they tend to decrease the value of a reinforcer, and so we think of them as being associated with reductions in that behaviour. Does that sound right? Yeah?
Yes.
Excellent, okay, brilliant. So, based on that, we quite often sort of apply that thinking to understanding different functions of challenging behaviour. Right? So this is a diagram that I've stolen from Sandy Toogood. So he did this really nice paper in IJPBS a little while back, just giving some sort of different descriptions of 4-term contingencies relating to service user and caregiver behaviour. So this is one of his examples. And so what he sort of describes is, well, we can start with the service user behaviour, challenge behaviour in this instance of hitting out, okay? And then we typically look at what's going on before that behaviour. And one of the things we might see, we might be able to observe, is a period of a sort of social deprivation for the individual, in which they haven't been interacting with people, for instance, for a little while. And then right before we see that behaviour, we might see this sort of SD of a caregiver arriving and such. And following that behaviour, we might see some attention being provided in one form or another, and that might be in a sort of positive, kindly way, or in a kind of reprimanding way.
So what is SR?
Sorry?
What is SR?
So SR is it's just a sort of symbol which means reinforcement, positive reinforcement, really. So a sort of positive consequence that follows that behaviour. So effectively, we've got a situation where because the person's been sort of deprived of social attention becomes very, very valuable. You're hungry for attention in a way, and so you're kind of motivated to engage in any behaviour which will sort of provide that attention for you in some form. And so often we see that sort of relationship occurring, and then that informs different things that we can do. Right? It informs, well, there's a really, really good sort of intervention we could do over here, which is just about reducing periods of social deprivation and increasing social contact for people generally. We predict lower rates of challenging behaviour, something like that. Right? That's kind of like sort of traditional thinking in PBS. So we can do that to sort of explain elements of a service user's challenging behaviour, but we can also think about a caregiver's behaviour in those kind of ways. And again, Sandy draws this out for us. So here we start thinking about, well, the consequence that's applied to this behaviour is sort of mediated by someone else. This is someone else's behaviour. This is a caregiver's behaviour that's providing some attention. And so how do we explain this behaviour? And again, when we look at what's going on before it, in this instance, from this sort of unit of analysis, backwards, there's the challenging behaviour of the service user, which is hugely aversive. Right? So it creates this, we think of this as an establishing operation. It creates this sort of aversive state in which escape from that behaviour, or the minimisation of that behaviour for the caregiver, becomes very reinforcing. Okay? So it increases the likelihood that the caregiver will do kind of anything that will bring an end to that behaviour as quickly as possible, really. And this, we have a sort of process, this is negative reinforcement, so something that removes an aversive state that leads to an increase in that behaviour. We term it as negative reinforcement, so it works in the opposite sort of way.
What do you mean? Can you give an example of negative reinforcement?
So my children are a little bit bigger now, but it still works the same. But when they were very, very tiny, if one of my daughters was crying for a long period of time, my experience of that is quite unpleasant, quite aversive after a while. And when they were really little, I tried just about anything to stop them crying. So I'd try and pick them up, or I'd try and cuddle them, or I might change their nappy, or give them to milk, or whatever it would be, give them to their mum, most likely. And then whichever behaviour of mine led to the end of that crying, well, I'm more likely to do that again in the same sort of situation in the future. So it's almost like a relief. And that's really what negative reinforcement is. And so it's similar here. It's almost like, this challenging behaviour creates this aversive, this really unpleasant situation. And so we're kind of motivated to do things to make it end, because it's unpleasant typically for us
I mean,
to be around.
Doing it for us, for ourselves, not for the person.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Not necessarily like sort of being aware of that, just doing it, just because it just happens. Yeah, not even having to sort of think that through. But yeah, you're right. The payoff is for us in that example. The payoff is for the caregiver. Yeah. So it's kind of simple, but it's also quite complicated. It explains lots and lots of things. And the danger always is, I think, when you strip things down to boxes, is that it makes it look like it's more simple. It can't possibly be that simple. But you can sort of add these things up, can't you, to explain more and more complicated situations based on the same basic sort of processes and principles. And that's what I think is quite exciting about behavioural approaches, really. So does that sound okay as that sort of basic premise? Because that's what we're going to sort of try and build on now. So in this article, we use this same sort of format of diagrams, really, talking about 4-term contingencies, and talking about service user behaviour and caregiver behaviour at the same time, really, because quite often we see these two things, they kind of mutually reinforce each other. We've got this kind of circle between these behaviours. So we give some examples that relate to behaviour challenges for a service user and try and explain those. We give some examples about other forms of service user behaviour, what we call like adaptive forms, that like more sort of functional positive behaviours that we might really want to see more of. And a whole bunch of different things about caregiver behaviour, so helpful things that caregivers could do and less helpful things that caregivers could do. And my aim today really is just to present a sort of a few of these different examples. Okay, so this first one, this is really the same thing that we've just seen presented in slightly different boxes, but it's the same sort of attention maintained function of challenging behaviour. So again, here we see this period in which a service user is receiving little attention, sort of deprived, they're lonely effectively, and then a caregiver arrives and it signals the potential availability of some kind of attention. We see the service user hitting out, and following this, they receive attention here in the form of being told off, really, being told to stop doing what they're doing, but it's still better than being lonely. There's still just some attention there. And so we think of like the function, like what this is sort of communicating, or what this is, the role this is serving for the individual is gaining attention. Yes, that's the same thing. It's the same thing. But there could be lots of other things going on here. So we might also find that as well as being alone and in this period of social deprivation, the individual's also in a kind of highly anxious state for whatever reason. Okay. Now this we might predict would have some additional effects on behaviour. Yeah. So in addition to being sort of lonely, they're also anxious. And so this becomes an even more aversive state for the individual. And because of that, it might be that attention becomes even more valuable than it was before, because now you're lonely and you're anxious. And when those are the MOs in a kind of combined way, you therefore might predict that this behaviour might happen even more. It might happen at higher rates, or it might happen to a higher severity, or the onset of it might be faster. Because they really, really need that attention more than in the attention deprivation situation alone. Yeah? So we just see more and more of it. And we might also hypothesise that the function of that behaviour is then slightly expanded. It still provides attention, but possibly that attention also has the role of reducing anxiety for an individual at that time. So we're just like expanding it out by thinking about these other, what we might call mental health or emotional well-being variables. But the model's the same, it kind of all slips in there. Now, one thing that try and kind of highlight again and again in the article, and I really always want to emphasise, is that this is just an example. Okay, this is not saying that this is what happens for everybody that's experiencing anxiety and displays challenging behaviour, because it will be different for different people. For some people, when you're experiencing anxiety, the last thing you want is attention from other people. Actually, what you might want is to be alone. And so you'll do lots of things to avoid attention from other people and to be alone. You wouldn't be motivated by accessing attention. You might be more motivated by avoiding attention. Right? So it's just an example. It's just an example to think how those things could link together. But it's not a prescriptive kind of model. All things with PBS. Does that hang together so far? We're good? Excellent. Okay. There we go. We've got a lot of marrows on this one. Where are all the boxes? Okay. So in this example, let's take it a little bit further. We can start thinking about other forms of behaviour that a service user might display. So here we go start with a discriminative stimulus of a caregiver asking an individual, how are you? Okay. And we might see different things happening after this. SD on different occasions. So sometimes we might see that the service user smiles. That's their behaviour. Someone says, how are you? And they smile back. Okay. And on other instances, we might see the caregiver asks, how are you? And the individual hits out, displays some kind of challenging behaviour, for instance. So the SD is the same, but there's some sort of variability in the response. And different consequences might follow these, you might predict. So after the smiling, It might be that the behaviour of the caregiver provides the consequence of asking, well, let's sit together. And there's some kind of social interaction. So it serves this kind of attention maintained function. Yeah, it's kind of like a useful way of accessing and a functional way of accessing attention. And following the hitting, we might see a different kind of consequence. The caregiver might say, well, okay, I'll leave you alone, you clearly need some time on your own. In which case, it's serving this kind of avoidance of attention function, right? And that still all makes sense. It's just different examples of the same stuff before. But somehow we've got to explain the variability. We've got to explain, well, this is the same. And this is sometimes what sort of, I think we all struggle with, that we can't understand the variability. It's like on some days we do this, and we're fine, and on other days, this is really problematic, or such and such can do this with them, and this happens, and someone else does it, and we get a completely different kind of picture. So there's no rhyme or reason, and it's all about the blooding. But maybe if we think about, again, sort of emotional states as these like motivational operations, we might be able to explain a little bit of that variability. It's only one of the ways. There's other ways of explaining it as well, of course. But so we might suggest that when the individual's experiencing a relatively kind of calm, stable mood, this kind of pathway becomes more likely. The stable mood, accessing attention from someone else, being around other people, might be quite reinforcing to something someone's looking for. So you're more likely to engage in behaviours like smiling, which lead to social attention, right? But then in other instances, perhaps when the individual's in a low mood, accessing attention might be something they really don't want to occur. So they might be more motivated to engage in behaviours which would lead to a reduction in that behaviour. Just really want to be alone, right? And again, it's not always like that. Some people in experiencing a low mood might want the opposite entirely. Okay, it's got to be individualised, but you could see you could just change the bits round and the processes would kind of work in the same way. We're still talking about motivational operations and SDs and different forms of reinforcement. Okay. So, this is the same thing. There's not much colour on this one. This is really how we present the diagrams that I've been talking about in the paper. They're a nightmare to present to when they're like this, but just wanted to sort of show you what they look like. This is the same thing as on the last slide, but kind of in black and white. It's got a few more bits on it. And one of the things to point out is that we discriminate there between the establishing operations and abolishing operations in each case, right? So with the top one, this individual in a stable mood, so creates an establishing operation, things which will lead to attention, but also abolishes behaviours which lead to less attention, and vice versa for the low mood. So we get this kind of crossover going on. So we've got an MO that increases the likelihood of behaviours that gain attention and decreases the likelihood of those that limit it, and vice versa. Okay. So these are some of the sort of things which are focusing on service user behaviours, and we can apply very it's nice, very similar things really, same principles to think about caregiver behaviour, because of course it's all just more behaviour, isn't it? And the processes are the same, but for sort of illustrative purposes that can be quite useful, I think. So here we'll think about the SD as the service user arriving on the scene. Okay. And again, there might be variability in the responses, the behaviours of a caregiver in response to that SD. So sometimes we might see the caregiver saying, "Oh, how are you?" Nice positive social response. In other instances, we might see the caregiver really ignoring that potential interaction and carrying on with some paperwork or walking away or whatever it is. And different consequences would follow. So it might be that in this pathway, after the caregiver behaves in this kind of behaviour, it leads to a kind of positive interaction with the service user. You could imagine that, couldn't you? Kind of like sort of flowing into some kind of interaction. And so in a way, for the caregiver, it serves an attention maintaining kind of function. And in the other example, the ignoring behaviour might be more likely to lead to the service user eventually withdrawing. And so that interaction doesn't happen. And in a way, you could think of that as a avoidance of attention kind of function. And again, we might think that, well, if we look at the emotional states of the caregiver at those times, that might sort of explain or help predict which response they engage in at any given time. So again, when in a stable mood, perhaps accessing attention, interacting with service users becomes more motivating, becomes more reinforcing, so they might be more likely to engage in these kind of behaviours. On other days, the emotional state is somewhat different, actually, and that might be really tricky, might be really aversive. So it's something you kind of want to avoid.
Sorry, Nick.
Yeah.
The MO is that staff's emotional state.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. Got to keep highlighting the same thing, yeah. So here, this is staff behaviour.
Yeah.
So this is the antecedents for that behaviour. But yeah, you're absolutely right. It's the emotional state of the caregiver. Previously, emotional state of the service user. Yeah. But so the same thing, really. We just flipped around who's who in this example. You can imagine both of these things actually happening at the same time. You need a lot of boxes to show that. Okay, so this is the last one. This is the big finale. So hold on to your hats, right? So here we've kind of described this a little bit up here, right at the beginning. This was the sort of negative reinforcement example related to caregiver behaviour. So this is almost like the bit you sort of described as they're doing it. The motivation for the staff's behaviour, caregivers' behaviour, is something which is reinforcing for them. So we describe the challenging behaviour of the service user. We describe that as an MO. It creates this aversive state in which escape from that behaviour, avoidance of that behaviour, becomes very reinforcing to the individual who's close to it. So following that, we might see the caregiver avoiding some kind of reprimand, and tell the individual to stop doing what they're doing, to pack it in. And we might see a momentary reduction in that challenging behaviour. Long term, it's very likely to continue, but just for a little while, it might stop. And that's enough to reinforce that reprimand behaviour for a caregiver. Yeah. So that's the usual scenario. Again, that might be even more likely in certain situations. So imagine, in addition to experiencing challenging behaviour, the caregiver's in a very anxious state. Yeah. Well, then we might expect to see even more reprimanding behaviour, because it's even more aversive to be around challenging behaviour when you're also very, very anxious. So we see more of this kind of behaviour. We see the challenge behaviour reduce a little bit, and in a way, anxiety would drop a little bit after that as well. Although long term, it would probably be maintained. Really. But it's the kind of instantaneous reduction here, which is enough to kind of keep that behaviour going in the future. But we're also interested, of course, in when staff are doing the right thing, or caregivers are doing the right things, and often they do the right things, even in the context of challenging behaviour, which is remarkable, really. It almost doesn't make sense in terms of the model. Why would anyone, or how could anyone, tolerate being in that sort of aversive situation and doing the right thing? So we might see, again, in response to challenging behaviour, caregiver asking, how can I help you? What can I do? And really be looking out to do something that would be useful, be genuinely useful. And we might predict, well, that might be more possible when in a sort of more stable, calm mood. It gives a little bit more space to be able to do and engage in that kind of way. And then we might see all sorts of things. The consequence might be a reduction in challenging behaviour still, actually, if you're doing the right thing and kind of finding the right solution for the individual. It might happen straight away, it might happen a little bit later, but we predict some longer term gains for each of those individuals, for the service user because they're having the right support, and for the caregiver because they're working through that kind of interaction. And so at least a sort of basic level, that would maybe suggest two things or two hypotheses. One that unhelpful caregiver behaviour that reduces challenging behaviour in the immediate term, but probably maintains it in the long term, is much more likely when the individual's in a sort of emotionally difficult place, whether they're anxious or in a low mood or frustrated or however else we want to conceptualise whatever that is. But at the same time, in the context of a more sort of stable, calm mood, again, however we phrase that, helpful caregiver behaviour, doing the right thing, doing the thing that's needed, can be possible, even in the presence of challenging behaviour. So if we want to kind of see more of this, which really we do, this is the name of the game, isn't it? Because that's what will change things, then we've got to do something about this. That's the hypothesis. Okay. So, a few bits to sort of just wind that up, and then it would be very nice to have some more sort of discussion. So I've tried to emphasise, but I will say it again, that these are only some of the possible relationships. This is a very, very kind of complex scenario. We're talking about the behaviour of different people, different types of behaviour. We're talking about emotional well-being and struggling to think how exactly to sort of describe that. But some of those, it considers only possible aspects of mental health. I'm only giving examples which are talking about mood, really. And that's not everything that mental health is. It's not just about mood, but it's almost like gives something we can get hold of just to start to think about these things. And all sorts of different variations and other relationships are very, very likely. But hopefully it gives a bit of a grasp about how some of these things might slot together in a way which is consistent with the basic processes that we talk about in relation to other aspects of behaviour in PBS and elsewhere. It's not like we've got to invent an entirely new framework to explain these things. So hopefully it starts to integrate them. And hopefully, and we talk about this a little bit in the end of the paper, it gives a little bit of possibility about what else we could do. Once we know how these things maybe slot together and maintain difficulties for people, we could start to think about how to change them. And what we don't get onto, but is I think an area for the future, is making things a little bit more tricky, but taking, instead of the unit of analysis as challenging behaviour, taking those mental health variables as the unit of behaviour to be analysed. So what we don't do there is say, well, where does that mental health variable come from in the first place, and what's maintaining that, and what's led to that? And that's another paper, or papers that hopefully as a community we could work towards. But sort of exploring those things would give really the solution potentially to how to support those mental health needs specifically. So that's pretty much me. See, I was thinking of half an hour, and I randomly stuck to half an hour, which is quite unheard of for me. So it would be very nice to have some sort of thoughts and discussion and anything you've got, really. Thank you very much. Cheers.
These slides going to be available afterwards to get the references.
£5 a slide, though. Absolutely, yes. I think they're given over to the conference, so yeah, we can make this available as well. And, yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Are they available online?
I don't know if these slides particularly will be.
We'll find out in a minute. We'll let you know.
They're very welcome to be, and I'm sorry I didn't put it up there, but I'm at the Tizard Centre. Probably should have said that right at the beginning. Tizard Centre at University of Kent. My email is on the website there. If you were to email me, I'll send you the paper or whatever else you need and want. So that's all there. Yeah. Are we done? Yeah, let's go out in the sunshine. Brilliant, thank you very much.